Modern history has witnessed many nations approaching the threshold of great power status, but only a very few have truly managed to break through. In the second half of the 19th century, the United States and Russia rose almost simultaneously. However, by the early 20th century, the United States had ultimately developed into the world's leading industrial nation, replacing Britain. Meanwhile, Russia fell into instability, repeatedly cycling between war and revolution. Many historians believe that the rise of a major power requires at least 50 years of peaceful and stable development. During this period, a country can shift its strategic focus to economic building, fully realize its development potential, and narrow the gap with the global hegemon. This era of peace and stability is also referred to as a period of strategic development. The rise of a major power requires at least 50 years of peaceful and stable development. In modern history, France, Russia, Germany, and the United States were all once rivals of Britain. However, only the United States experienced more than 50 years of uninterrupted strategic development. Other countries, just as they were nearing the completion of their modernization process, were drawn into wars that ultimately led to their failure to rise. After the unification of Germany, Russia gained a favorable geographical environment. Taking Russia as an example, its period of strategic development began in 1861 following Tsar Alexander II's serfdom reform. Thanks to this reform, Russia's massive population advantage was unleashed, allowing the country to enter a phase of rapid industrialization. At the same time, during this period, the geopolitical landscape of Europe also shifted in a way that favored Russia. After Germany's unification, Germany and France became bitter enemies. France no longer pursued an anti-Russian policy, but instead formed an alliance with Russia, providing low-interest loans to support Russia's industrialization. Along with the rise of Germany, Britain gradually shifted its containment focus from Russia to Central Europe, allowing Russia to break free from the constraints imposed by its defeat in the Crimean War and rebuild its Black Sea Fleet. To prevent the alliance between France and Russia, Otto von Bismarck adopted a pro-Russian policy, actively mediating the conflicts between Russia and Austria over the Balkans and supporting Russia's territorial expansion in the east. It can be said that a unified Germany acted as a shield for Russia's rise. In the latter half of the 19th century, Russia became the focal point of European diplomacy, with major powers actively seeking its favor. At that time, Russia's international status was comparable to that of China at the end of the Cold War or India today. Thanks to the emancipation reform and a favorable international environment, Russia's economy entered a phase of rapid growth. From 1870 to 1900, Russia's total industrial output grew at an average annual rate of 7.4%, the highest in the world, surpassing both the United States and Germany, the two emerging economies. During the same period, older powers like Britain and France saw industrial growth rates of only about 2%. Causing them to lose their status as the world's industrial centers. In the first half of the 19th century, the United States promoted economic growth through infrastructure investment. America's period of strategic development began in 1866, shortly after the Civil War, slightly later than Russia's. With the geographical advantage of being situated between two oceans, the U.S. adopted an isolationist policy, refraining from involvement in European affairs and focusing on domestic development. To boost domestic industrial growth, the United States implemented a protectionist trade policy with high tariffs and launched the construction of an extensive nationwide railway system. In 1850, the total length of U.S. railways was only 9,000 miles. By 1900, this figure had surged to 220,000 miles, with the Pacific Railroad being the most significant. This line reduced travel time between the east and west coasts from 6 months to just 7 days, not only fostering the prosperity of surrounding towns but also strengthening national unity, both economically and politically. The rapid development of infrastructure also spurred the growth of industries such as banking, steel, coal, and electricity, propelling the United States into a period of rapid industrialization. From 1870 to 1900, the total industrial output of the U.S. grew at an average annual rate of 7.1%, second only to Russia. Given the larger scale of the U.S. economy, this growth rate was particularly impressive. This large-scale economic boom can only be compared to China's rise from 1980 to 2010. Thanks to its economic prosperity, the U.S. saw the emergence of a number of globally competitive multinational corporations and a strong, expanding middle class. American society gradually moved toward greater stability. By the end of the 19th century, the United States, Russia, and Germany, as emerging economies, had begun to surpass long-established powers like Britain and France in terms of industrial output. In the mid-19th century, the British Empire was in its Victorian era and widely known as the workshop of the world. In 1870, Britain's industrial output accounted for about 32% of global production. But by 1900, that figure had dropped to 18.5%, and the United States had surpassed Britain in terms of industrial share. In 1870, France's industrial output was still higher than that of Germany and Russia. However, by 1900, France had fallen far behind both. As great powers, both the United States and Russia possessed vast territories, large populations, and abundant natural resources, giving them virtually unlimited development potential. By the end of the 19th century, alongside their economic booms, the United States was challenging Britain's naval supremacy, while Russia was challenging Britain on land. Looking at the year 1900, if the U.S. as a continental-scale nation were to enjoy another 20 years of peace, it would become the world's #1 power, replacing Britain's position in both the global economy and finance. For Russia, as a major power with no shortage of food or energy, an additional 20 years of peace could have made it the leading industrial power in Europe, completely transforming the geopolitical landscape of the continent since the modern era. However, according to the final outcome of history, the United States succeeded in 1921 in replacing Britain's economic position, with its total industrial output surpassing that of the entire European continent. The world's financial center shifted from London to New York, and the global currency transitioned from the British pound to the US dollar. In contrast, Russia faced many upheavals. After the Russian Revolution of 1917, the country was thrown into continuous turmoil, marked by civil war, the Soviet-Polish War, major famines, and other crises. By 1928, the Soviet Union's share of global industrial output was significantly lower than it had been under the Tsarist regime. It was only when Stalin implemented forced industrialization policies, at the cost of the people's well-being, that the USSR regained its status as an industrial power. So why was the US able to rise while Russia failed? One important reason is that the United States took advantage of diplomatic opportunities to extend its period of peaceful rise to 56 years. Meanwhile, Russia was drawn into war too early, limiting its peaceful development to only 43 years before entering a prolonged period of stagnation. The Russo-Japanese War marked the beginning of a period of decline for Russia. In 1902, in an effort to curb Russia's rise, Britain signed the Anglo-Japanese alliance with Japan to limit Russian expansion in the East China Sea. In 1904, with British support, Japan launched a surprise attack on Russia's Pacific Fleet at Port Arthur, triggering the Russo-Japanese War. Since France and Russia were military allies, Britain sought to prevent France from assisting Russia by proactively improving its relations with France and settling colonial disputes. Britain recognized Morocco as a French sphere of influence, while France acknowledged Egypt as under British control. This diplomatic arrangement led France to adopt a neutral stance during the Russo-Japanese War. As a result, Russia was defeated by Japan and was forced to recognize Korea as a Japanese sphere of influence and to cede several strategic rights in northeast China, such as Port Arthur and the South Manchuria Railway, to Japan. The defeat in the war delivered a major shock to Russia. The Tsar had hoped the war could redirect domestic dissatisfaction, but the military failure severely undermined his authority. The working class lost faith in the government, and the 1905 revolution broke out in Russia. This revolution lasted for 3 years, plunging Russian society into chaos. Foreign investment rapidly withdrew, and economic growth slowed, bringing an end to an economic boom that had lasted more than 4 decades. Sergei Witte, the head of government, was forced to resign due to the failure. After the 1905 revolution ended, Russia initiated the Stolypin reforms, aimed at promoting industrialization through land privatization, dismantling the rural commune system, and moving peasants into factory labor. However, The Stolypin reforms failed to restore Russia to its previous trajectory of development, as the country now faced the most formidable rival of the 20th century, the German Empire. At the beginning of the 20th century, Germany's industrial output gradually surpassed that of Britain, making it the leading industrial power in Europe. Contrary to traditional assumptions, after its rise, Germany's greatest fear was not France or Britain, but Russia, the vast country to the east. At that time, Russia had a population of 170 million, accounting for 10% of the global population. With a high birth rate, Russia stood in stark contrast to France's demographic decline. Russia also possessed vast territories. During the modern era, Russia's Asian lands were largely underutilized. However, after the Second Industrial Revolution, the rise of industries such as oil, chemicals, electricity, and steel made Russia's inland resources increasingly vital. Although public discourse in Germany often downplayed Russia, deep down, Germans were deeply fearful of the emerging power. They worried that if Russia were given enough time to develop, Germany would be unable to withstand the looming threat from the Slavs. To contain Russia's rise, with German support, the Austro-Hungarian Empire repeatedly provoked military conflicts with Russia, triggering the Bosnian crisis in the Balkan region and exerting constant military pressure on Russia. Germany's goal was clear: to drag Russia into an endless arms race, thereby disrupting its development. If the arms race failed to stop Russia's rise, Germany planned to launch a preventive war. As political tensions in Europe escalated in 1907, Britain, France, and Russia signed the Triple Entente, forming two major military blocs in Europe, the Central Powers and the Entente. All nations significantly increased their military budgets. Faced with mounting geopolitical pressure, Russia had no choice but to expand its military and prepare for war. Massive military spending consumed more than half of the state budget, forcing Russia to slash civilian spending and abandon its focus on economic development. In 1911, Prime Minister Stolypin was assassinated. The reforms in Russia failed. Mass layoffs and deepening social conflicts followed. In 1914, the Sarajevo incident toppled the geopolitical dominoes of Europe's balance of power, and humanity entered the era of World War. To win the war, the Tsar sent millions of soldiers to the front lines and mobilized all available resources for the military. This led to severe shortages of supplies in Russia and a sharp increase in food prices. In 1917, the Russian Revolution broke out, plunging the country into a prolonged civil war, and the economic achievements accumulated over decades vanished. From 1918 to 1922, the Soviet Union was continuously embroiled in civil war. Many talented individuals either emigrated abroad or perished in the conflict. After Lenin's death in 1924, the USSR was once again thrown into a power struggle, with leaders like Trotsky and Bukharin successively removed. The national development path kept shifting, and the people's living conditions deteriorated further. It wasn't until 1927, when Stalin fully consolidated power, that the USSR returned to a focus on economic construction. However, by then, more than 20 years had passed since the Russo-Japanese War. In retrospect, Russia's national destiny entered a period of decline starting in 1904 due to its early involvement in a large-scale war. The economic miracle that had lasted for over 4 decades came to an end, and the country fell into a trap of slow growth. Moreover, the later Russian Revolution and the arms race in Europe prevented Russia from ever returning to a phase of rapid economic growth and laid the groundwork for the October Revolution. Had Russia maintained a stable strategy and avoided the Russo-Japanese War, subsequent reforms might have proceeded more smoothly. Under the basic scenario, Russia was expected to become an industrial power with a population of 600 million in the latter half of the 20th century, with an economy rivaling that of the United States. It could have also overcome the limitations in agriculture and light industry experienced during the Soviet era and become a fully modernized nation. However, all of that vanished when war broke out. In reality, by the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Britain already viewed Russia, the United States, and Germany as major competitors. However, while Russia and Germany were restrained, the United States avoided this fate, maintained a high rate of economic growth, and ultimately became the world's dominant power. By the late 19th century, Both the United States and Russia sought to expand toward the Far East, as it was the most densely populated region in the world with vast market potential. Moreover, the Qing dynasty was weak at the time and unable to resist Western aggression. The United States focused on the Western Pacific, particularly the Philippines, which was under Spanish control. Russia, on the other hand, aimed at northeast China and Korea, with ambitions of gaining access to the Pacific Ocean. In the end, the U.S. plan succeeded while Russia's failed. The Spanish-American War transformed the Pacific Ocean into America's backyard. In 1898, the U.S. used the explosion of the battleship Maine as a pretext to launch a war against Spain, attacking the long-established but declining colonial power. Under the U.S. military's offensive, Spanish forces in Cuba and the Philippines were repeatedly defeated. Eventually, the United States and Spain signed a peace treaty, under which Spain ceded Cuba, the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico to the U.S. Moreover, the U.S. took the opportunity to occupy the Hawaiian Islands. Thus, America's sphere of influence expanded into the Western Pacific, providing a strategic foothold for advancing into the Far East. Not stopping there, in 1899, the U.S. sent diplomatic notes to the major powers, demanding the implementation of an open-door policy in China. In name, this policy aimed to protect China's territorial integrity and sovereignty, but in reality, it was a demand for the major powers to share their interests and turn China into a market for American goods. In response, Britain, which held significant commercial interests in the Yangtze River Basin, chose to accept the proposal and tacitly agreed to allow the U.S. to expand its influence in East Asia. In contrast, when Russia attempted to encroach upon northeast China in 1904, Britain intervened and forced Russia into a decisive war with Japan. Meanwhile, in 1898, the U.S. seized the Philippines from Spain and pushed forward the open-door policy in China without facing any resistance from Britain. Why was this the case? The main reason was that the United States had seized a strategic opportunity at the end of the 19th century. It wasn't that Britain was unwilling to intervene in the U.S. Spanish War. It was that it no longer had the capability to do so. In 1898, Britain and France faced the Fashoda crisis when the two nations clashed over control of the Upper Nile. Tensions between them nearly escalated into war, as both sides were ready to use military force. To Britain, if French forces gained control of the Upper Nile, they might advance into Egypt and seize the Suez Canal, a red line Britain could not tolerate. As a result, Britain mobilized its military and drew up plans to destroy the French Navy. The Fashoda crisis lasted nearly half a year, placing the two most powerful military nations in Europe, Britain and France, under extreme tension. While Britain and France were locked in confrontation, the United States seized the opportunity to defeat Spain and force it into signing a humiliating treaty. The Fashoda standoff weakened Britain's position from one of prosperity to vulnerability. After resolving the dispute with France, Britain turned its attention toward the United States. At that time, the U.S. Navy was still relatively weak and could not compare to the Royal Navy. However, just at that moment, the Boer War broke out in South Africa, dragging Britain once again into the quagmire of war. This turn of events ended up saving the fate of the United States. The Boers were descendants of Dutch settlers. Although small in number, they retained a tradition of hunting, horseback riding, and marksmanship, making them a formidable fighting force. The British were reluctant to confront such a tenacious enemy, but South Africa's gold mines, a crucial factor during the gold standard era, forced Britain's hand. Whoever controlled the gold mines held the power to mint currency, which was one of the key pillars of the British Empire's global dominance. Britain mobilized a total of 400,000 troops and spent approximately £200 million, equivalent to 1.5 times its annual fiscal revenue, in an effort to decisively defeat the Boers. However, since the Boers were white, European public opinion largely sympathized with them. Germany even provided them with modern Mauser rifles and Krupp artillery, which made the Boer resistance increasingly fierce. Even Winston Churchill, who would later become Britain's famous prime minister, was captured by the Boers during the conflict. Angry and frustrated, the British no longer cared about international law. They implemented a three cleans policy against the Boers: burn everything, destroy everything, kill everyone, and sent all captured civilians to concentration camps. The Boer War lasted 3 years, and although Britain ultimately won, it suffered heavy losses in both power and international reputation. The British government began to reassess its colonial policies, abandoning territorial expansion and shifting focus to domestic development. While Britain was bogged down in the Boer War, the United States seized the opportunity to implement its open-door policy in China, taking over many of Britain's trade interests in the Far East. Lacking the capacity to fight on two fronts, Britain had no choice but to turn a blind eye to America's encroachment on its interests. After the war, in an effort to contain Russia's rise, Britain even proactively drew the United States into alignment, allowing the U.S. to build a navy with larger tonnage. This mirrored how America's founding fathers once relied on French support to win their War of Independence. Abraham Lincoln took advantage of the wars of unification in Germany and Italy to consolidate the South. By the end of the 19th century, the United States had leveraged the Boer War and other international events to complete its expansion in the Far East, emerging as a Pacific power. In reality, Russia attempted to penetrate northeast China via the Chinese Eastern Railway. America's successful expansion in the Far East stirred deep jealousy in Russia. Russia mistakenly believed that Britain was a power strong on the outside but weak internally, and thus unwilling to intervene in East Asian affairs. In 1900, Russia seized the opportunity during the Eight-Nation Alliance's intervention in China to station 200,000 troops and occupy northeast China. Within Russia, there were two factions on how to handle the northeast China issue. The moderate faction, led by Finance Minister Sergei Witte, advocated a silkworm-eating mulberry leaves strategy, gradually taking over the region through railway construction and slow migration, without provoking other major powers. In contrast, the hardline faction, represented by the Russian military, pushed for the outright annexation of northeast China and turning the region into a Russian province. This faction believed that the Far East was not part of Britain's core interests, and that Russia's expansion into northeast China would not trigger British intervention. Moreover, they aimed to push Russia's border all the way to the Great Wall. Ultimately, the Russian Tsar adopted the hardliners' plan, deciding to annex northeast China by force, believing that Britain would not interfere. However, the Tsar had miscalculated. By that time, Britain had emerged from the quagmire of the Boer War and chose to militarily intervene to halt Russia's expansion. Britain then aligned with the United States, who also feared Russia's rising influence, and provided strong support to Japan, leading to the orchestration of the Russo-Japanese War. This war caused Russia to lose its nationalist momentum, and for the following 2 decades, it had no chance of recovery. The arms race in Europe in the early 20th century was a geopolitical disaster for Russia but opened the door for the rise of the United States. As the threat from European powers diminished, the United States was able to shift its strategic focus inward and pursue domestic development. By the end of the Gilded Age, from the late 19th to the early 20th century, although the U.S. had become the world's largest economy, income inequality within the country had grown increasingly severe. A coalition of monopolistic corporations, formed by financial oligarchs, had come to dominate American politics, with many senators bribed with money. Presidents who did not comply with the will of these oligarchs could face the risk of assassination. These monopolies used the excuse of being too big to fail to bind the U.S. government and society, becoming economic parasites that weighed heavily on the people. In this context, Theodore Roosevelt, a progressive, rose to power. He was determined to reform the problems caused by the monopolistic corporations dominating the U.S. economy. He utilized the media to expose the hidden corners of the financial oligarchy, thereby gaining strong support from the public, which gave him enough political strength to push forward anti-monopoly policies. Numerous monopolies were broken up, and even the famous Standard Oil Company of tycoon John D. Rockefeller was dismantled. The business environment in the U.S. improved, and small and medium-sized enterprises sprang up like mushrooms after the rain. To combat government corruption, American journalists launched investigative campaigns that uncovered many dark corners in politics and business, thereby restoring public trust in the government. On the other hand, in pursuit of higher profits, American capitalists forced workers to work excessively long hours, up to 10 hours a day. This became unbearable for the American people, who began organizing large-scale strikes. To ease social tensions, Roosevelt, a member of the Republican Party, sided with the workers, demanding that businesses shorten working hours, implement the 8-hour workday, and raise workers' wages. These actions helped Roosevelt gain strong support from many segments of the working class. Theodore Roosevelt's anti-monopoly policies played a crucial role in America's rise. Had the monopoly trend gone unchecked at that time, the U.S. economy could have gradually become Latinized, meaning wealth would be held by a small elite, leading to economic stagnation and the rise of populism. Politics would swing continuously between the far left and far right. As a result, Roosevelt, along with figures like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and Abraham Lincoln, came to be regarded as among the greatest individuals in American history. When World War I broke out, the destinies of the U.S. and Russia, two potential great powers, were reversed. The blockade of the Bosphorus Strait cut off Russia's trade routes, leading to a severe shortage of civilian supplies and ultimately triggering a nationwide revolution. In contrast, the United States grew wealthy from the war. From being the world's largest debtor nation, it became the world's largest creditor. The U.S. seized this opportunity to import advanced technologies from Europe at very low costs and attracted many highly skilled immigrants fleeing the war. After World War I, the United States rose to become a peer rival to Britain. At that time, Britain was no longer capable of restraining America's rise. In 1921, the United States, Britain, Japan, and other countries convened the Washington Conference to negotiate the division of interests among the major powers. The U.S. succeeded in dissolving the Anglo-Japanese alliance, pushing Japan into isolation in the East China Sea. Furthermore, the five-power naval treaty between the U.S., Britain, Japan, France, and Italy was signed. This treaty not only gave the United States a naval advantage over Japan, but also marked Britain's formal recognition of America's equal status. This established a G2 global structure with joint dominance by Britain and the United States. The U.S. succeeded in surpassing Britain in a relatively peaceful manner, laying the foundation for a shift in global hegemony between the two nations. In modern history, the United States is the only country that has avoided the Thucydides trap and risen to become the world's hegemon. This term in international relations refers to the risk of conflict that arises when a rising power threatens the dominance of an established power. In the 1860s, both the United States and Russia rose almost simultaneously. However, thanks to exceptional diplomatic skill and accurate strategic assessments, the U.S. extended its strategic growth period to 56 years, until Britain gave up trying to contain it and chose instead to share power. Russia, on the other hand, was drawn into large-scale conflicts too early, sustaining a peaceful development phase for only 43 years before failing just as it was nearing the completion of its modernization. If Russia had enjoyed 10 more years of peaceful development, it might have become the largest economy in Europe. In that case, neither Britain nor Germany would have been able to stop Russia's rise. Imagine a scenario where the United States had been intervened against by Britain during its war with Spain and ultimately lost. This could have led to political crises and the erosion of democracy. The U.S. might have quickly fallen into partisan conflict and economic decline. Meanwhile, if Russia had avoided the Russo-Japanese War and focused on domestic development, Stolypin's reforms could have been a remarkable success, transforming Russia into a modern constitutional monarchy. Had this happened, today's global geopolitical landscape would be completely different. The United States might have become a chaotic nation like Brazil, dominated by corporate monopolies and drug cartels, plagued by civil wars and frequent coups. Russia, with a population of 600 million, could have become the world's largest economy, controlling a vast portion of Eastern Europe and thriving in agriculture, commerce, culture, and science. In such a scenario, the headquarters of the United Nations might well have been located in Moscow rather than New York. For a major power, a prolonged period of peace is critical for development. 50 years is a pivotal threshold in a nation's destiny. Countries that fail to reach this milestone often fall short in their rise, while those that surpass it can achieve success. This reflects the rise of China and how the United States seeks to contain it in order to maintain its own dominance. For present-day China, If 1980 is considered the starting point of its peaceful rise, then its strategic development period has lasted 44 years so far. However, history shows that a great power typically requires at least 50 years of peace to fully unleash its economic potential and truly rise. This means that China's most important task at present is to extend its period of peaceful development, reaching the strategic threshold necessary to complete modernization and become capable of competing with the United States. China's peaceful rise largely depends on the external geopolitical environment. In fact, since the start of reform and opening up, China's ability to sustain its peaceful rise has primarily relied on the international geopolitical climate, particularly its relationship with the United States. As long as U.S.-China relations remain stable and balanced, external risks will stay manageable, allowing China to focus on economic development. Conversely, if U.S.-China relations deteriorate, the external environment will become unstable, forcing China to divert resources into national security to handle emerging threats. In the 1980s, the anchor that stabilized U.S.-China relations was the mutual threat from the Soviet Union. To counter the Red Giant, the United States even treated China as a temporary military ally. In the 1990s, the balancing factor in U.S.-China relations was trade. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, China swiftly pushed forward market reforms. Under strong lobbying from American capitalists, President Clinton's policy toward China shifted from confrontation to cooperation. In the 2000s, the balancing factor became the war on terror. After George W. Bush took office, he initially intended to use military measures to contain China's rise. However, the events of September 11th dramatically changed this trajectory. To rally public support for the war on terror, the Bush administration shifted its strategic focus from East Asia to the Middle East, creating a valuable strategic window for China. Following the 2008 financial crisis, U.S.-China relations were held together by cooperation in stabilizing global markets. Under President Obama, the two countries coordinated on financial and monetary policy, using economic levers to help lift the global economy out of the deflation trap. Because China was the largest foreign creditor of the United States, Obama repeatedly refused to label China as a currency manipulator. It wasn't until the outbreak of the trade war in 2018 that U.S.-China relations truly entered a period of serious breakdown. Nevertheless, at least during the early years of Trump's presidency, due to the United States' isolationist policies, the geopolitical pressure on China was relatively low. On the contrary, China took advantage of the distancing between the U.S. and its allies to negotiate a China-Europe free trade agreement and to push forward the RCEP with Japan. The trend of the East rising, the West declining continued, and China's window for peaceful rise was extended once again. Overall, the period from 1980 to 2019 can be considered a golden age of China's economic development. Since 1980, China has benefited from a peaceful rise for over 40 years. However, historical experience suggests that a rising power typically requires at least 50 years of peace to fully unleash its economic potential and truly emerge as a great power. This means China still needs at least another 5 to 10 years of strategic development to gain the capacity to compete with the United States. If China can avoid major geopolitical risks in the next 5 to 10 years and focus on domestic development, resolving issues related to real estate, local debt, and promoting high-tech industries such as new energy, semiconductors, and aerospace, it could enter a phase of stable growth. By 2030, China may very well become a developed country with economic influence on par with that of the United States. At that point, the United States would no longer be capable of pursuing a decoupling policy from China, as most Western countries would not be able to bear the cost of severing ties with China. How the U.S. contained China under Biden. However, after President Biden took office, the global situation rapidly deteriorated. The war between Russia and Ukraine in 2022 is considered the most significant international event since the Cold War. The old international order is now on the verge of collapse. Back in 2017, when President Donald Trump began his first term, although a trade war erupted between the U.S. and China, the Taiwan Strait remained relatively stable. With the mindset of a businessman, Trump viewed Hong Kong and Taiwan as bargaining chips. As long as China made concessions on trade, he was willing to hold back on issues related to Hong Kong and Taiwan. However, tensions in the Taiwan Strait were significantly amplified after President Joe Biden took office. In Biden's Indo-Pacific strategy, Taiwan is a critical link. Only by worsening the situation in the Taiwan Strait can foreign investment be driven out of China. In reality, before the Russia-Ukraine war, 90% of multinational companies believed that in the long run, war would not break out in the Taiwan Strait, and that the US and China would not engage in military confrontation. As a result, when investing in China, companies rarely considered geopolitical risks. However, after the outbreak of the Russia-Ukraine war, the percentage of businesses ignoring such risks dropped from 90% to just 40%. Moreover, as the war dragged on, Europe began implementing a de-risking policy toward China under the pretext of securing supply chain safety by relocating parts of its industries out of China. In terms of trade sanctions, the United States mainly targeted China's semiconductor sector, while the European Union focused on renewable energy industries. Before the Russia-Ukraine war, Europe played the role of a lubricant in the US-China relationship. After the U.S. intensified technological sanctions against China in 2018, Europe became China's largest technological gateway, helping China continue its industrial upgrading process. Thanks to Europe's involvement, Washington's containment policy toward China had multiple loopholes, allowing China to continue acquiring advanced technologies and capital. However, following the outbreak of the war in Ukraine, Europe began viewing China and Russia as being on the same side and initiated a de-risking strategy aimed at a limited decoupling from China. In reality, one of the key reasons why the post-Cold War world was able to maintain a balance of power was the European Union's ability to act with strategic autonomy. While the EU co-founded NATO with the US and the UK, forming the world's largest military alliance, it still maintained close economic ties with both China and Russia. This economic cooperation helped offset some of the military pressure NATO imposed on those two powers. Trade volume between China and the European Union (EU) has reached $8 trillion. In the context of US.China decoupling, China-EU trade has become a cornerstone supporting globalization. As long as China and the EU remain connected economically, China's doors to the world will remain open. On the other hand, prior to the Russia-Ukraine war, trade between the EU and Russia reached nearly $300 billion. Cheap energy imports from Russia helped lower industrial production costs in the EU, allowing the region to maintain strong export competitiveness despite its relatively low labor intensity. Conversely, advanced machinery and equipment from Europe enhanced Russia's industrial capacity, enabling the country to sustain a complete industrial system even amid labor shortages. In other words, before the Russia-Ukraine conflict erupted, the world could be seen as divided into two major blocks. One military alliance composed of the United States, the United Kingdom, and the EU, and one economic alliance composed of China, Russia, and the EU. While the United States has long sought to divide the Eurasian continent under the pretext of security concerns, China and the EU have aimed to strengthen intracontinental ties through economic integration. In a world where security is considered paramount, the globe will be split into two opposing and isolated blocks, East and West. In contrast, if development is prioritized, the Eurasian continent will move toward deeper and broader economic integration. National leaders will increasingly prioritize employment and economic development over geopolitical conflict. The European Union has served as a lubricant in relations between the Anglo-American bloc and the Sino-Russian bloc. The EU's existence has helped reduce the intensity of confrontation between China and the United States. Both China and Europe are the biggest beneficiaries of globalization, and neither wants to see the Eurasian continent fragmented or driven into conflict. They share a mutual need for a peaceful and stable international environment that fosters development. However, from the U.S. perspective, Eurasian integration is a strategic threat. Due to its geographic distance, the United States would be excluded from such a framework, accelerating the global trend toward de-dollarization. Under President Joe Biden's administration, the concept of balance of power equates to maintaining peace, precisely what China needs most for its continued rise. In contrast, During Donald Trump's second term, U.S. strategy toward China shifted from hoping for reform to full-scale confrontation. Initially, Trump's team promoted a pro-Russia, anti-China approach. Even if the U.S. could not bring Russia into its camp, the aim was at least to ensure Russia's neutrality in the U.S.-China rivalry. That way, the U.S. could withdraw resources from Europe and the Middle East and redirect them toward the Indo-Pacific. This strategy had the potential to be more damaging than Biden's technology sanctions. However, to win over Russia, the U.S. needed cooperation from far-right forces in Europe, especially in Germany. This explains why figures like Elon Musk and J.D. Vance have actively intervened in German elections and publicly supported the far-right party Alternative für Deutschland. However, after the German elections, the far-right parties only secured around 20% of the vote, dashing hopes of forming a government. Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni also rejected Trump's invitation to form an alliance and chose to maintain a unified foreign policy with the EU. Following the German election, it is clear that traditional institutional forces will continue to dominate EU leadership in the coming years. This means that Trump's strategy of forming a pro-Russia, anti-China alliance via Europe's far right is unlikely to succeed. If Germany continues to be governed by a coalition of the CDU and SPD, it will not easily withdraw support for Ukraine, nor will it readily resume trade with Russia. Should Ukraine collapse, the EU itself may face a crisis of disintegration. Despite its strong economic foundation, Europe's societal and political resilience is quite fragile. Anti-war sentiment is widespread. Wealthy Western European countries are mostly concerned with protecting their own interests and are reluctant to shoulder the burden of Eastern Europe's security. The EU was built upon a foundation of shared values. If that foundation is broken, the very existence of the European Union could be at risk. If Europe weakens or disintegrates, the greatest beneficiaries will be the United States and Russia. A large portion of Europe's industry and talent will flow toward the U.S., not only because of geographic proximity but also due to cultural and linguistic similarities. As for Russia, it will aim to take control of Eastern Europe and move toward unifying the 300 million Slavic people under its influence. According to the Republican Party's plan, there is strong interest in reestablishing a new Yalta-style world order, essentially dividing the world with Russia, as was done after World War II, handing over Eastern Europe to Russian dominance. Once Russia consolidates power in Eastern Europe, it will not stop there. Its next targets will likely be Central Asia, followed by efforts to secure access to the South China Sea, with the goal of restoring the Soviet-era sphere of influence. This scenario poses a serious threat to China. To Donald Trump, the best way to make America great again is to return the country to a Cold War state, which is seen by many rural white Americans as a golden era in American history. The collapse of the Soviet Union allowed Europe to enter an era of strategic autonomy, leading to German reunification, the creation of the euro, and the rise of the EU as China's largest trading partner, helping to alleviate geopolitical pressure from both the United States and Russia. Over the past 30 years, the world has gradually become multipolar and globalized. The Chinese people and residents of U.S. coastal regions, primarily in democratic states, have been the biggest beneficiaries. In contrast, Russia and residents of inland America, mostly in Republican states, have become the biggest losers. Russia lacks warm water ports and missed the information technology revolution, leading to a sharp decline in its international standing. While the U.S. has accumulated vast wealth through finance and technology, it paid the price of offshoring its manufacturing, resulting in a hollowed-out economy. Trump supporters, mainly from the working class, have experienced mass unemployment and rely heavily on government welfare. As a result, both the MAGA movement in the U.S. and the Russian leadership have found common ground in their opposition to globalization and a desire to restructure the global order. A return to a Yalta-style order, the erection of tariff walls, a push for bloc-based confrontation, replacing globalization with regionalism and multipolarity with bipolarity, all of these could improve the standing of both MAGA and Russia. Both the U.S. and Russia are resource-rich powers, capable of self-sufficiency or even colluding to monopolize benefits. In contrast, China and Europe, despite their industrial development, are resource-poor, and a return to a Cold War-like order would severely harm their interests. Trump cannot oppose globalization alone, he needs Russia's cooperation. If the US and Russia join forces, the US would tighten control over Eurasian maritime trade routes. Russia would restrict overland trade routes across Eurasia. A visible geopolitical wall, combined with an invisible tariff wall, would be enough to isolate the eastern and western ends of the Eurasian continent. If Ukraine falls, a domino effect could follow. Europe might be fragmented or divided between US and Russian spheres of influence. In such a scenario, China would face a stronger US and a resurgent Soviet-like Russia, with potentially devastating consequences. For China, the best course of action is to avoid geopolitical risks over the next 5 to 10 years and focus on domestic development. If successful, China could enter a phase of stable growth, and by 2030, potentially become a developed nation with economic influence on par with the US. However, external risks remain, and the most serious among them is the issue of the Taiwan Strait.